close your eyes for a second and imagine the most distant place you can think of. Not another country, not another planet, a place that is truly unreachable, where there is no light, where there is no sound, or at least that's what you'd expect, and where any living thing should die the moment it arrived. Now open your eyes, because that place isn't somewhere in space. It's here, right beneath you. There is a point on Earth so deep that if you dropped Mount Everest into it, the peak would still be swallowed by darkness. A place harder to reach than the moon. A place we have barely seen, and maybe shouldn't be trying to see at all. This is the Mariana Trench. But this isn't just a story about depth, and it's not really a story about the ocean. This is a story about what happens when you go beyond the conditions life was ever meant to survive. Because nearly 11 kilometers down, pressure doesn't just crush. It rewrites physics, it bends chemistry, and most disturbingly, it reshapes life itself. And yet, it's not empty. There are creatures down there that don't just survive, they belong. Creatures that literally fall apart if you bring them to the surface. Creatures that should not exist, but do. And then there's something else. When humans first reached the bottom, they expected silence. Total stillness. A dead world. Instead, they heard something. Not the ocean, not whales, not earthquakes. Something they couldn't explain. And from that moment on, the Mariana Trench stopped being a place. It became a question. And yet, something exists down there. Quiet, patient, beyond our reach. Something that has been there far longer than we have, waiting in the slow dark for as long as the trench itself. If you're lying in the dark right now, or just watching this in silence, don't rush. Because what we're about to do isn't just go deeper. We're going somewhere that doesn't behave like the world you know. And the deeper we go, the less familiar everything becomes. If you're ready, let's begin. Welcome, not to a place on the map, not to a country or a continent, or even something you could point to on a globe. Tonight, we're going somewhere that technically exists, but almost doesn't belong to our world. Because if you really think about it, everything you know about Earth, everything you've ever seen, every city, every road, every forest, every mountain, all of it exists on a surface so thin that, on a planetary scale, it's almost nothing. A fragile skin, a shallow layer. A place where light reaches, where air exists, where life moves quickly. But beneath that, beneath the illusion of familiarity, there is another world. A world that begins exactly where your understanding ends. We like to believe we've explored our planet. We zoom in on maps. We scroll through satellite images. We drop a pin anywhere on Earth and instantly see it in perfect clarity. It gives you a certain confidence, a quiet assumption that there are no real mysteries left. But that confidence collapses the moment you reach the shoreline. Because that's where the map stops being real. Everything beyond that line, everything under the ocean, is not true. It's interpreted, guessed, reconstructed from fragments. If you could strip away the water and actually look at the true surface of this planet, you wouldn't see a smooth blue sphere. You would see something broken, jagged, violent, massive scars. Mountain ranges taller than Everest, hidden upside down, and somewhere within those scars, there is a place so deep, so extreme, that it almost feels like the Mariana Trench. Not a hole, not a simple crack, but a slow seam. a crack stretching nearly 2,500 kilometers across the Earth's crust, where one part of the planet is slowly, relentlessly being pulled down and consumed. And at its deepest point, something strange happened. The rules begin to change, because depth is not just distance. Depth is pressure, and pressure is what turns a place from unfamiliar into impossible. Every 10 meters you go down into the ocean, the weight increases, quietly, steadily. You don't feel it at first, but it never stops. At 100 meters, your body would already begin to fail. At 1,000 meters, you wouldn't survive. But the trench doesn't stop there. It keeps going, down, past everything life was designed for, until finally, at nearly 11,000 meters, the pressure becomes something else entirely. Not just force, but presence. More than 1,000 times the pressure you feel right now. Imagine every part of your body being held by a weight as steady as the Earth itself. Not for a moment, not as a wave, but constantly, unmoving, unchanging. Even steel becomes flexible here. Glass softens. Nothing rigid truly belongs to this depth. Even the strongest vessels stay only brief, because the trench is not just deep. It resists you, it pushes back. And that's the reason it remained hidden for so long. Not because we didn't want to explore it, but because we weren't built to survive it. Space is empty. You can build a system, control it, create your own environment, but the trench is already full. Full of pressure, full of darkness, full of a force that does not negotiate. And that's why, even today, with all our instruments, with satellites and deep ocean robots, we still don't fully know what. Not really, not completely. And in that not knowing, there is room for the imagination to settle. So for a moment, let your thoughts drift. And maybe that's exactly why it matters. Because that's what the unknown does. It doesn't give you answers. It gives you space. And your mind fills that space on its own. When you hear a sound in complete darkness, in a place you cannot reach, you don't imagine something ordinary. You imagine scale, something large enough to exist unnoticed, something adapted to a world you don't understand. And for a long time, there was one idea that refused to disappear. A shadow carried from prehistory into modern imagination. A creature so large, so dominant, that even the idea of it surviving feels almost believable. The logic is simple. If something wanted to disappear, truly disappear, where would it go? Not the surface, too visible. Not shallow water, too active. It would go deeper, into a place we cannot follow, into pressure, into darkness, into silence, into the trench. It's a powerful idea that something ancient, something built for a different Earth, didn't go extinct. It just left, moved downward, escaped into the last place. We never fully. But this is where reality pushes back, because the trench is not just deep. It's empty, not visually, but energetically. There's almost no food, no constant supply, no easy prey. Everything that lives there exists on the edge of starvation. A massive predator, something like Megalodon, would not dominate that environment. It would die in it. There simply isn't enough energy to sustain something that large, something that active, something that requires constant feeding. And there is something else, evidence, or rather, the absence of it. No teeth, no remains, no verified sightings, nothing that survives scrutiny. So the idea fades, not completely, but enough to step aside for something stranger. Because while the trench does not support the giants we imagine, it creates its own. And they are nothing like what we expect. Because in the deep, evolution doesn't follow our intuition. It doesn't reward strength. It doesn't reward speed. It rewards something else: efficiency, patience, and adaptation to pressure. And sometimes that adaptation leads to something unusual. Creatures that should be small become large. Not aggressively, not dramatically, but slowly, over time. There is a pattern observed again and again in the deep ocean. Small organisms, when exposed to extreme cold, extreme pressure, and extreme scarcity, not because they need to dominate, but because there's no reason to stop. Metabolism slows, life stretches, time itself feels different. And so, something simple, something almost insignificant, becomes something else. Larger, heavier, slower. There are creatures down there that on the surface would fit on your fingertip, but in the trench, they grow to the size of your hand, and they move with a kind of quiet inevitability. Not rushing, not hunting in bursts, just existing, waiting. And this is where the illusion breaks completely, because the deep does not create monsters. It creates survivors, and those survivors look nothing like the things we fear. They are pale, soft, almost fragile, as if they weren't meant to exist at all. And yet, they're the most perfectly adapted beings on the planet. They do not resist the pressure, they accept it. They don't fight the environment, they become part of it. And the deeper you go, the more this becomes true. Until eventually, you reach a point where the idea of a normal creature no longer applies, where bones become optional, where structure becomes fluid, where the line between living and dissolving starts to blur. And in that place, something appears. Not large, not aggressive, but impossible. A fish. That should not exist. A fish. That shouldn't exist. Not because it's dangerous, not because it's large, but because, by everything we understand about biology, it should not be able to function at that depth. And yet, it does. It moves slowly, almost reluctantly, through water that would destroy anything from the surface. It doesn't look like a predator. It doesn't look like something built to survive. It looks unfinished. Its body is soft, not streamlined, not armored, soft, almost gelatinous. Its skin is pale, not the color of something alive in sunlight, but the color of something that has never seen it. A faint, almost translucent pink. If you look closely, you can see through it. Not completely, but enough to notice that what holds it together is barely holding. There are no visible scales, no protection, no clear defense. Its skeleton is not rigid bone. It's flexible, reduced, as if the idea of structure itself became unnecessary. Because here, structure is a liability. At that depth, pressure doesn't just press on the body, it changes the way proteins fold. It alters the way cells behave. Everything that gives a creature form begins to fail, unless it adapts. And this fish did something unusual. It didn't resist the pressure. It aligned with it. Inside its body, its cells are filled with special molecules, molecules that act almost like stabilizers, holding proteins together, keeping structures from collapsing, allowing its biology to function where it should. It is not strong, it is balanced, perfectly tuned to a force that would destroy everything else. And that balance comes with a cost, because this creature does not belong to our world. If you were to bring it to the surface, if you tried to take it out of its environment, it wouldn't explode. It wouldn't thrash. It wouldn't even resist. It would simply begin to release. Its body, no longer held by the pressure that shaped it, would begin to drift apart. The form softens, the edges blur. Not violently, but quietly, as if it was never meant to exist anywhere else, because it wasn't. This is not a creature that survives the deep. It is a creature that requires it. The pressure is not its enemy. It is its support system. Without it, there is nothing left. And that's the part that's difficult to accept, because it means there are forms of life on this planet that are not just different from us, but incompatible with us. Just impossible to share the same world. And this fish, this soft, fragile, almost invisible creature, is the dominant predator of the deepest place on Earth. Not a monster, not a giant, but something quieter, something that survives, not by force, but by perfect adaptation. And it is not alone. For a moment, let that thought rest, that there is life that does not resist its world, that fits because it surrendered. And once you accept this, that the deep rewards softness and transparency and quiet surrender to pressure, you begin to notice a pattern. The deeper you go, the less solid life becomes. Creatures lose color, lose structure, lose visibility, until eventually, some of them disappear almost completely. Not metaphorically, physically. They become transparent, as if the only way to survive in total darkness is to stop being seen at all. Because in a place where there is no light, visibility becomes meaningless. There are no shadows, no contrast, no horizon, nothing to hide behind, only open water and distance. And in that kind of environment, traditional survival doesn't work. You can't camouflage yourself against darkness. You can't blend in when there's nothing to blend into. So evolution finds another solution. It removes you. Not completely. There are creatures down there that are not just pale. They are transparent. Not as a trick, not as a surface adaptation. Their bodies, their skin, their structure becomes something closer to glass than flesh. If you were to look at them, you wouldn't see a shape first. You would see absence, a distorted light passing through something that shouldn't be there. One of these creatures moves slowly through the water, almost weightless. Its body stretches like a soft, clear veil. No color, no pattern. Only two things remain visible, and something inside it, barely defined, barely real. This is the telescope octopus. It doesn't hide, it doesn't need to, because it is already almost invisible. But invisibility creates a problem, because while your body can disappear, some parts of you cannot. Your organs, your eyes, they still exist. And in a world where even the smallest signal can mean death. So the solution becomes more precise. Not just transparency, but there is another creature, floating, almost motionless, in the same darkness. Its body is completely clear, a fragile, gel-like structure, but inside it, there are parts that should give it away. Dense tissue, opaque shapes, things that would normally cast a shadow, but they don't, because this creature has learned something extraordinary. It produces its own light, not to be seen, but to erase itself. This is where the deep ocean changes completely. Because light is no longer illumination. It becomes a tool, a weapon, a language. This creature emits a faint glow from within its own body. Carefully calibrated, not bright, not noticeable, just enough to match the faintest residual light filtering down from above. So when something looks at it from below, there is no shadow, no outline, nothing to detect. It becomes perfectly hidden. This is called counter-illumination, and it is one of the most precise forms of camouflage ever evolved. But this is just one use of light, because in the deep, light is rare, and anything rare becomes powerful. Most of the creatures down there do not rely on vision the way we do. They react to contrast, movement, sudden signals. So if you can create light, you can control attention. You can attract, or you can deceive. And that leads to something more aggressive. Because not everything in the deep is trying to hide. Some things are waiting, motionless, patient, conserving every possible unit of energy until something appears. And for that, they use light differently, not to disappear, but to lure. There is a creature that has perfected this. It doesn't chase, it doesn't search, it doesn't waste movement. Instead, it creates a signal. A small, isolated, as glowing point in total darkness. And in a place where there's nothing else to see, that is enough. Because curiosity exists even in the deep. Something small, something unaware, moves closer, drawn in, not by instinct, but by the absence of everything else. And just before it understands what it has come close to, everything quietly. There is no struggle, no sound, only stillness where movement used to be. Because in the deep, you don't need speed, you need certainty, and light provides it. Because in the deep, nothing moves without purpose. Every movement costs energy, every mistake costs survival. So the most efficient predator is not the fastest. It is the one that doesn't move at all. Somewhere in that darkness, there is a shape. You wouldn't notice it at first, not because it is hidden well, but because it is almost indistinguishable from the absence around it. It hangs perfectly still, not drifting, not reacting, just existing in place. Its body is dense, compact, built not for speed, but for waiting. Its mouth is too not proportionate, not balanced. A shape designed for a single act, and above it, extending forward, there is something delicate. A thin filament, soft, flexible, almost like a thread. At the very end of it, there is a small, pulsing light. It doesn't shine brightly, it flickers subtly, just enough. And in a world where there's nothing else, that is everything. Because out there, in the black, something sees it. Not clear, but enough to notice a signal, something alive, something worth approaching. And slowly, very slowly, there is no urgency, no fear, because there's nothing to compare it to. No reference, no warning, just a single point of light in endless darkness. And as it approaches, nothing changes. The predator does not react, does not adjust, does not move. It waits until the distance is no longer distance, until the moment becomes inevitable. And then everything collapses into a single action. The mouth opens, not like a bite, but like a trap, a sudden expansion, a vacuum, and the light disappears, gone. No struggle, no sound, just absent. This is the anglerfish, not a hunter in the way we understand, but a system, a mechanism built around certainty. It does not chase. It allows the world to come to. And once you understand that, you realize something else. This is not deception. This is efficiency. Because in the deep, energy is everything, and movement is waste. But there is another predator, one that does not wait, one that does not rely on curiosity, one that has evolved a completely different advantage. Because while most creatures in the deep see only one thing, blue light, the faint residue of the surface, there is a creature that sees something else, something hidden, something no other organism can detect. It moves, not still, not passive, but controlled, deliberate. Its body is long, dark, its teeth too large to fully conceal. They extend outward like something unfinished. But the most important part is near its eyes. Two small points, almost invisible until they activate, a faint glow, not blue, not green, but red, deep, subtle, almost impossible to note. Because in the deep ocean, red light does not exist. It is absorbed long before it reaches that depth. Which means nothing down there is designed to see it, except this, the dragonfish. It emits red light, like a private signal, a wavelength that passes through the darkness unnoticed, invisible to everything around it. And that changes everything. Because now it can see without being seen. It moves forward, slowly. Its red light touching shapes, revealing forms that believe they are. To its prey, there is still only darkness. But to the dragonfish, the world is visible, clear, exposed. And that creates a moment that only one side understands. Because the prey never reacts. It doesn't flee. It doesn't panic. It doesn't even know it has been found until the distance closes. And just like before, it ends. Instantly. But this time, without illusion. Because the deception was never visible. It existed entirely, outside perception. And that might be the most unsettling part of the deep. Not the creatures, not the darkness, but the idea that something can see you perfectly while you remain completely unaware that it's there. And then everything slows down. The further you descend, the less movement remains. Not because there is nothing there, but because everything that exists has learned to conserve. Energy disappears, speed disappears, even intention begins to fade, until eventually you reach the floor. Not dramatic, no cliffs, no structures, just a vast, endless, pale surface, soft like dust, but heavier, denser. A fine sediment that has been falling for millions of years, layer by layer. A slow accumulation of everything that has ever died above. Fragments of shells, microscopic skeletons, particles of organic matter, all of it, settling, the final destination of the surface world. At first glance, it looks empty, lifeless, still. But if you wait long enough, you start to notice something. The surface is not flat, not completely. There are shapes, subtle, almost like impressions. Small structures, scattered. They don't move, they don't react, they don't behave like anything we recognize as alive. And yet, they are. Each one of these shapes is a single organism. Not a colony, not a group. One, a single cell, larger than anything a cell should be. Some of them the size of your hand, others even larger. They are called xenophyophores, and they are one of the strangest forms of life on this planet because they break something fundamental, our understanding of scale. We associate complexity with size. We assume that something large must be made of many parts, organs, systems, structures working together. But here, that rule collapsed. These organisms have none of that. No brain, no nervous system, no internal hierarchy, just a single, continuous, a living structure without division. And yet, they build slowly, patiently. They collect particles from the sediment, tiny grains, fragments of shells, mineral dust, and they assemble them, not randomly, but with a kind of quiet precision. They create structures, delicate, branching, almost architectural, like something constructed rather than grown. But there is no thought behind it, no planning, no awareness, just process, chemical, automatic, endless. And the purpose is simple: to survive in a world where there's almost nothing. Because down here, food does not arrive quickly. It falls, slowly, from a place these organisms will never see. A faint, constant, almost invisible snowfall, marine snow. Particles drifting down from the surface, the remains of life filtered through layers of water, consumed, reprocessed, and consumed again before anything reaches this depth. By the time it arrives here, it is barely enough, barely nutrition, barely energy, and yet everything depends on it. So these organisms maximize surface area. Stretch outward, capture whatever passes, and wait. Because waiting is the dominant strategy. Time behaves differently here. A process that would take seconds on the surface takes minutes, hours, days, and in some cases, far longer. There are organisms beneath the seabed, not just on it, living inside the sediment, inside the rock itself, that may take years to perform a single biological function. Years for one cycle, decades for meaningful change, possibly centuries to divide once. Life reduced to its slowest possible form, not inactive, but stretched to the edge of time. And when you observe it, it creates a strange feeling, because it doesn't look alive in the way you understand. It doesn't respond. It doesn't express. It simply exists continuously, indifferently, as if the concept of urgency never reached this place. And that's when another realization appears. The deep ocean is not just a different environment, it is a different timeline. A place where life moves so slowly that from our perspective, it almost doesn't move at all. And in that stillness, something else begins to form. A system, an ecosystem built not on abundance, but on scarcity. A world where everything is connected by absence rather than presence. And once you understand that, you start to see how something extraordinary can happen. Because in a place where nothing arrives quickly, when something finally does, it changes everything. Instantly, completely. Because in a world where nothing happens quickly, when something finally does, it doesn't feel like an event. It feels like an interruption, a break, in a system built on waiting, somewhere far above, in a place filled with light, movement, and noise. A body, massive, heavy, once powerful, stops moving, not violently, just stops. And then it begins to fall, slowly at first, barely noticeable, but it doesn't stop, because gravity doesn't forget, and the ocean doesn't resist. The body sinks, passing through layers of a world it once belonged to, through light, into dimness, into shadow, and then into complete darkness. The descent takes time, hours, days, sometimes longer, and during that fall, it changes. The surface breaks, small fragments separate and drift away, but the mass remains. And eventually, after traveling a distance almost impossible to imagine, it reaches the bottom. And in that moment, everything changes, because what arrives is not just a body, it is energy, a concentration of everything the deep does not have. And the signal spreads instantly, not through sound, not through light, but through chemistry, a scent, invisible, carried through the water, and somewhere in the darkness, something detects it, then something else, then more, from different directions, from different depths. They begin to move, slowly at first, then with purpose, because this is not a normal moment. This is an opportunity that may not happen again for years or decades. The first to arrive are the hunters, the ones that can move, the ones that have been waiting for exactly this. Shapes emerge from the darkness, soft bodies, pale forms. The snailfish, moving with a kind of quiet precision, not rushing, because there is no competition yet. Then others, more numerous, amphipods, small, but not small anymore, larger than they should be, their pale bodies reflecting faint light as they swarm. And then the feeding begins, not chaotic, not violent in the way we imagine, but efficient. Pieces are removed layer by layer, nothing is wasted. Every movement has because this is not just food, this is survival, compressed into a single event. And this phase can last months, sometimes longer, until the surface is stripped, until what remains is no longer flesh, but structure. And then everything changes again. Because once the large feeders leave, another system takes over. Smaller organisms arrive, not interested in the body itself, but in what it has changed. The surrounding sediment, now rich, saturated, transformed by decay. And this attracts another layer of life. Worms, crustaceans, microbial blooms. The ground itself becomes active. A localized ecosystem formed around a single event. And this stage lasts years, not days, years. But the final phase is the strangest, because what remains is and bone still holds energy. Inside it, lipids, dense, locked, unavailable to most, but not all. There are organisms that specialize in this. They arrive quietly, attach themselves to the structure, and begin to break it down, not externally, but from within. There are worms that do not eat in the way you understand. They dissolve bone, extract nutrients directly, turning a skeleton into a living system, and around them, bacteria begin to grow, chemosynthetic, producing energy from chemical reactions, just like the vents. So the skeleton becomes something else, not remains, but a new environment, a reef, a structure that supports life for decades, sometimes longer. One event, one death, creating a system They can last longer than a human lifetime. And then eventually, even that ends. The structure collapses. The nutrients disappear, and the environment returns to what it was. Still, empty, waiting again. And that's the cycle. A world built on absence, occasionally interrupted by abundance. And when you see it this way, you start to understand something deeper. The trench is not just a place. It is a system that depends on the surface, on what falls from above. Which means, no matter how isolated it feels, it is still connected. And that connection has changed. Because what falls now is not the same as it once was. Because for millions of years, that system worked. Slow, unforgiving, but stable. Everything that reached the deep belonged there. It was part of the cycle. It had once been alive. It broke down. It fed something else. And eventually, it did. Nothing remained. No trace, no accumulation, just process. Endless, perfect process. And then something new entered the system. Not suddenly, not as a single event, but gradually, quietly, almost unnoticed. At first, it didn't seem important. Small, unfamiliar shapes, objects that did not behave like anything that had fallen before. They did not dissolve. They did not break down. They did not become part of the cycle. They simply... And then, one day, someone noticed something. Not in theory, not in a lab, but there, at the bottom, in the deepest place, a simple plastic bag, 7 miles down, in a place that had stayed untouched for most of history. It had drifted there, quietly. Long before any of us had even thought about it. Long before anyone had reached that depth in person. A quiet reminder that everything on the surface is somehow connected to everything. Because this was supposed to be the last untouched environment. The final boundary. A place defined by its... And yet, it wasn't isolated at all. It was connected. Connected to everything above it. Every city, every coastline, everything we use, everything we discard, eventually finds its way down. And once it gets there, it doesn't leave. Because the trench is not an open system. It's a trap. A deep, V-shaped structure designed by geology to collect. So anything that sinks, anything heavy enough, anything persistent enough, ends up there and stays for decades, centuries, possibly longer. And plastic does not behave like organic matter. It doesn't feed the system. It interrupts it. Fragments break apart, but never disappear. They become smaller and smaller, until they are no longer visible, but still present. Invisible particles moving through the water, settling into the sediment, entering the bodies of organisms that have no way to process. The amphipods ingest them, the simplest organisms absorb them, and slowly, quietly, the system changes, not violently, not in a way that can be seen immediately, but in a way that accumulates. Because unlike everything else, this does not cycle, it builds. Plastic is only the beginning, because what we send into the deep is not always accidental. For a long time, we treated the ocean as something infinite, too large to fill, too deep to matter. So when there was something we didn't know how to deal with, something dangerous, something unwanted, we sent it down. Industrial waste, heavy metals, chemical byproducts, things that couldn't be stored safely on land, things that were easier to forget. And then, something even more difficult. something that remains dangerous long after we are gone. Radioactive material, sealed in containers, lowered into the ocean, dropped, with the assumption that depth equals safety, that distance equals disappearance. But the trench does not erase, and those containers were never designed for this environment. Not for pressure, not for time. They corrode, they weaken, and eventually they fail. And when they do, there's nowhere for the contents to go. They don't disperse freely, they settle into the same sediment that supports life, into the same system that depends on balance. And now, that balance includes something unnatural, something persistent, something that was never meant to be part of this world. And that creates a new question. Because the trench was once defined by mystery, by the unknown. But now, part of what's down there is known, and it came from us. Not exploration, not discovery, but consequence. And that changes how we look at it. Because the deepest place on Earth is no longer just an alien world. It is also a reflection of everything we chose not to see. Because beneath everything we've just seen, beneath the life, beneath the silence, beneath even the waste we left behind, something older, something that was here long before any organism ever adapted to this depth. The trench itself is not empty space. It is not just a location. It is an action, something that is happening right now, slowly, relentlessly, without pause. If you could remove the water, if you could stand above the earth and watch this place over millions of years, you wouldn't see stillness. You would see movement, almost invisible, but unstoppable. Because the Mariana Trench is where the planet begins to consume its two massive plates, pieces of the Earth's crust, larger than continents, are moving. Not quickly, not violently, but constantly. One of them, older, denser, heavier, is being forced downward, pushed beneath the other, not smoothly, not cleanly, but with resistance, with friction, with tension. Imagine something vast being bent, but slowly, continuously forced into a shape it was never meant to hold. That is what's happening here. The Pacific Plate is being pulled down into the mantle, not dropped, dragged, scraped, pressed into the interior of the planet. And as it descends, it carries everything with it: sediment, rock, history. Entire sections of the ocean floor are being erased, not instantly, but permanently. Because once something enters this process, it does not return. It is heated, compressed, broken down, and reformed into something else. And the trench is the surface expression of that process, a visible mark of something happening far below. But this movement is not smooth. It cannot be. Because friction builds, sections of the plate get stuck, held in place while the rest continues to push. And that creates tension, massive tension, stored energy, accumulating over years, decades, sometimes, until eventually it releases, suddenly, violently, an earthquake, but not the kind you feel on land, not shallow, not sharp. These occur deep, hundreds of kilometers below the surface, in conditions where rock should not break, where heat should make everything soft, and yet it fractures, because the force is too great. And when that energy moves upward, it doesn't just affect the ground, it affects the ocean. The entire column of water above the trench can shift, lift, and that movement can travel across entire oceans until it reaches land as a wave that carries the force of something that began in darkness. So the trench is not isolated. It is connected to the surface, to continents, to everything we think of as stable. Because stability is an illusion. The ground you stand on is moving, slowly, silently, in ways you cannot feel. But that movement is constant. And somewhere far below that movement, there are places where the earth is being taken apart and rebuilt. At the same time, the trench is one of those places, not an end, but a transition, where the surface becomes something else and disappears. And when you look at it this way, the depth, the darkness, the pressure, all of it starts to feel different. Because this is not just a deep ocean, this is a boundary between what exists and what is being erased. And that boundary never stops moving. Not for you, not for anything. It will continue long after everything on the surface has changed. And that leads to another realization. Because if the trench is constantly consuming the surface, then what exists today will not exist forever. Not as it is, not in the same shape, and not in the same place. Because once you understand that the ground itself is moving, that continents are not fixed, that even the deepest parts of the ocean are part of a process, something shifts. The map stops feeling permanent. We grow up looking at it as if it's finished, as if the continents are placed, locked, final. They are temporary. Everything you recognize, every coastline, every border, every familiar shape is just a moment, a single frame in something much longer. Because if you could watch the Earth over millions of years, you wouldn't see stability. You would see drift, slow, inevitable movement, continents separating, colliding, breaking apart, and reforming, oceans opening and then closing again. And in that movement, something else happens. Parts of the world disappear, not dramatically, not all at once, but quietly, subtly. A coastline shifts, a region a landmass sinks beneath rising water, and eventually, not destroyed, just submerged. There have been entire landscapes, entire ecosystems that once existed on the surface, now lying beneath the ocean, completely hidden. Places where rivers flowed, where forests grew, where animals moved, all of it now covered by kilometers of. And over time, even those traces fade, buried under sediment, pressed into layers, reduced to fragments, then to nothing recognizable. Because the planet does not preserve, it recycles. Everything that exists is eventually broken down, absorbed, and transformed. And that includes us, not just biologically, but structurally. Everything we build, cities, roads, infrastructure, all of it feels solid, permanent, but it isn't. Given enough time, it disappears. Metal corrodes, concrete cracks, structures collapse, and eventually they are buried, integrated into the same system that processes everything else. And if enough time passes, there is no trace, not of intention, not of design, just material. And this leads to a question that feels uncomfortable once you sit. If something existed here before us, not animals, not simple life, but something structured, something intelligent, would we even know? If it lasted long enough ago, if it ended completely, would anything remain? Or would it be processed, the same way everything else is, reduced to chemistry. Because when scientists look back into the geological record, they don't see a perfect archive. They see fragments, incomplete layers, gaps, moments preserved by chance, not by design. And most of what has ever existed is missing, which means if something complex, something advanced, had existed for a short period of time, it might not leave a clear trace. Not structures, not machines, but something else. Something more subtle, chemical signatures, changes in the atmosphere, unusual concentrations, locked into rock. And when we look back, we do find anomalies. Moments in Earth's history where something changed very quickly. Temperature spikes, sudden increases in carbon, shifts that don't follow the usual patterns. They have explanation. Volcanic activity, methane release, natural causes. But sometimes the speed of those changes feels familiar because it resembles what is happening now. And that doesn't prove anything. But it introduces a possibility that what we see as unique might not be. That civilization might not be a single event, but a pattern, something that appears, disrupts, and disappears, leaving behind only a faint signal, a thin layer, almost invisible, and then the system resets and continues, and the next cycle begins. The planet does not remember. It does not preserve intention, and over enough time, even that becomes difficult to read. Which means everything you see now, everything you recognize as real, exists only temporarily. And eventually, it will become part of the same process that created the trench. Consumed, recycled, forgotten. And that realization does something subtle. It shifts your perspective from space to time. Because the deepest unknown is not what lies below you, but how long anything above you can actually last. Everything we've followed so far exists beneath you, out of sight, quiet, but there's something else just as quiet, just as constant, and it surrounds you from above, invisible everywhere, right now, extending far beyond the atmosphere, far beyond what you can see. There is a structure, not physically, but functionally, a field, the magnetosphere, a vast, shifting, invisible shell generated deep within the earth. It comes from the core, an ocean of molten iron, moving, churning, circling, and that movement creates a force, a magnetic field strong enough to extend thousands of kilometers into space, and without it, nothing we've talked about would matter. Because without this field, the atmosphere would not stay. The oceans would not remain. Radiation from the sun would strip everything away. But inevitably, like it did on Mars. So we assume this field is stable, constant, reliable, like gravity. But it isn't. It changes, it shifts. And right now, there is a place on Earth where that protection is a region stretching across the Atlantic from South America toward Africa, known as the South Atlantic Anomaly. If you were standing there, you wouldn't notice anything. The sky would look normal. The air would feel the same. Nothing would seem different. But above you, the magnetic field is thinner, weaker, and that allows something to get close. Particles from space, normally deflected by the field, dip lower in this region, closer to Earth, close enough to interfere. Satellites that pass through it experience failures, sensors shut down, data becomes corrupted, systems glitch. The Hubble Space Telescope, one of the most precise instruments ever built, turns off its sensitive components every time it passes over this region, not as a precaution, as a necessity, because the interference is strong enough to damage it. And this anomaly is not static. It's growing, slowly but measurably, expanding, shifting, and it is not alone, because the magnetic field is not fixed, it moves. The magnetic North Pole, the reference point for navigation, is not stable. For centuries, it drifted slowly, barely noticeable. But in recent decades, something changed. It accelerated, now moving faster than expected across the Arctic, from Canada toward Siberia, at a speed that forced scientists to update navigation models ahead of schedule. Because if they didn't, systems would become inaccurate, gradually, then suddenly. And this movement is not unusual, not in geological time, because the poles have done something before, something far more extreme. They have flipped, north becoming south, south becoming north, not once but many times, hundreds, and during that process, the field weakens, not slightly, in some cases, dropping to a fraction of its current strength. There was a moment about 42,000 years ago when the field fell to around 5% of what it is now. For a period of time, the planet was almost unprotected. We don't know exactly what that looked like from the surface, but we can model it. And what those models suggest is unsettling. Because during that transition, the field does not disappear cleanly. It becomes chaotic. Multiple poles forming, shifting, unstable. And the sky changes. Auroras, normally confined to the poles, would spread, expanding, moving toward the equator, visible in places that have never seen them. The night sky filled with moving light, beautiful, but not, because at the same time, radiation levels increase, the barrier weakens, and the planet becomes exposed, not destroyed, but vulnerable. And the key point is this: this is not speculation. It has already happened multiple times, and the anomaly we see today may be a signal, not of immediate danger, but of movement, change, something happening deep inside the planet that we are only beginning to understand. Because just like the trench, the core is not still. It is active, dynamic, unpredictable, and what happens there does not stay. It affects everything: the surface, the atmosphere, the space around us. So when you step back and look at the whole system, something becomes clear. Instability is not isolated. It exists below and above. The ground is moving. The field is shifting. The protection is not constant. And all of it is happening slowly enough that we don't feel it, but fast enough that it matters. And that leads to a different kind of question. Not about what is hidden in the deep, but about what is happening to the system as a whole. Because if both the foundation and the protection are changing, then the planet is not as stable as it, and maybe it never was. Good. Now we go deeper, not into the ocean this time, but into the Earth itself. Because everything we've explored so far still exists near the surface. Even the trench, even the abyss is just a scratch, a thin boundary layer on something much larger. Because beneath your feet, far below the soil, below the rock, below everything you think of as ground, there is another world. And for a long time, we believed it was empty, sterile, dead, because it had to be. No sunlight, No oxygen, extreme pressure, heat, isolation, everything about it suggested impossibility. Life, we thought, was a surface phenomenon, a thin skin, dependent entirely on the sun. But that assumption was wrong, because when scientists began drilling, not just into the ocean floor, but into the crust itself, they found something. Not fossils, not remnants, but living organisms, deep, far deeper than anyone expected. Kilometers below the surface, inside solid rock, not in caves, not in underground lakes, but within the rock itself, inside microscopic fractures, tiny pockets of fluid, trapped for millions of years. There, they found life, bacteria, archaea, microorganisms that had never seen the sun, never interacted with the surface world, and most importantly, did not need it. This is what scientists now call the Deep Biosphere, and it changes everything. Because this is not a small system, it is not a rare anomaly, it is vast, possibly larger, in total biomass than all life on the surface combined, forests, animals, humans, all of it, and still, there may be more life beneath us than above. But what makes this world truly unsettling is not just its size, it's its speed, or rather, its lack of it. Because life on the surface is fast. Everything is a race. Energy, food, reproduction. A bacterium in the open can divide every 20 minutes. Life expands, competes, consumes. But in the deep biosphere, there is no abundance, no sunlight, no constant flow of nutrients. Energy is almost non-existent. And so life there has adapted in a completely different way. It's slowed down, not slightly, but radically, to the point where the concept of time barely applies. Some of these organisms do not divide in hours or days. A single cell may take hundreds or thousands of years to divide once. Think about that. A living organism that reproduces once every millennium, and yet it is alive, functioning, existing, in a state that sits somewhere between life and stasis, not dead, but not fully active, almost suspended, almost timeless. These organisms survive on the smallest amounts of energy imaginable, chemical reactions between rock and water, the slow release of electrons from minerals, even radioactive decay, tiny amounts of radiation naturally present in the earth, providing just enough energy to sustain life. Barely, but enough. And this leads to something difficult to grasp, because these organisms have been there for millions of years, unchanged, unaffected by everything happening above. The extinction of the dinosaurs meant nothing. Ice ages came and went, irrelevant. Human civilization appeared, expanded, transformed the surface, and they did not notice. Because on their timescale, none of it lasted long enough to matter. To them, our entire history is a brief disturbance, a flicker, gone before it even registers. And that changes perspective, because we tend to think of ourselves as the dominant form of life, the most advanced, the most significant. But if you measure life by duration, by persistence, by resilience, then we are not even close. We are fast, but fragile, temporary, dependent. While beneath us, there exists a system that is slow, but nearly indestructible. A form of life that does not rely on sunlight, does not depend on climate, does not care about surface conditions, a system that could survive almost anything. And that leads to a dangerous question. If life can exist like this, independent, hidden, unaffected by extinction events, then what else could exist without us ever knowing? Not on another planet, not in another dimension, but here, already, deep enough to be invisible, slow enough to be undetectable, and old enough to predate everything we understand. Because once you accept that life does not need the sun, once you accept that it can survive on almost nothing, once you accept that it can exist for millions of years without interacting with us, then the idea that we have fully mapped life on Earth becomes impossible. And now the question changes. It's no longer what lives in the deep. It becomes what has been there all along while we were looking somewhere else. Good. Now we cross the line. This is where the story stops being just about biology and starts becoming something much more unsettling. Because everything we've discovered so far leads to one quiet realization. The Earth forgets. Not metaphorically, literally, it erases everything. Mountains collapse, continents shift, oceans rise and fall, and over time, even the strongest structures become dust. We tend to believe that what we build will last. Cities, monuments. We look at stone, steel, concrete, and we imagine permanence. But on geological timescales, none of it matters, because the Earth is not static. It is a machine, a slow, relentless recycling system. Let's run a simple thought experiment. Imagine humanity disappears. Tomorrow, no war, no explosion, no warning, just gone. What happens next? Within days, the power grid fails, cities go dark. Within weeks, plants begin reclaiming streets. Within years, roads crack, buildings weaken. Within centuries, steel rusts away, concrete crumbles. Within a few thousand years, almost everything we built is gone. And after millions of years, nothing recognizable remains. Not cities, not roads, not monuments. Even the continents themselves have changed shape. This is not speculation. This is what the geological record shows. Because when we look into the past, we don't see everything that existed. We see almost nothing. The fossil record is not a complete archive. It is a fragment, a broken memory. Most organisms never fossilize. Most events leave no trace. Which leads to a disturbing possibility. What if something existed before us and simply didn't leave enough evidence behind? This idea has a name, the Silurian hypothesis. And despite how it sounds, it is not science fiction. It is a real question asked by real scientists, not because they believe it happened, but because they cannot fully rule it out. The hypothesis is simple. If an industrial civilization had existed on Earth millions of years ago, would we even know? At first, the answer feels obvious. Of course we would. We would find cities, artifacts, technology. But now you understand the problem. None of those things survive deep time. They vanish. So scientists approach the question differently. They don't look for objects. They look for signatures. Because while buildings disappear, chemistry remains. A civilization does not just build. It alters the planet. When we burn fossil fuels, we release a specific type of carbon, carbon-12. It changes the chemical balance of the atmosphere, and that change gets recorded, locked into ocean sediments, preserved in rock, long after everything else is gone. We also leave behind things that nature does not produce. Plastics, synthetic chemicals, and most importantly, radioactive isotopes like plutonium, elements that should not exist naturally in those concentrations. These are fingerprints, not visible structures, but chemical anomalies. And when scientists look into Earth's past, they do find anomalies. One of the most famous is the Paleocene, Eocene thermal maximum. Around 56 million years ago, something happened. The planet suddenly heated up rapidly. Temperatures spiked, oceans became acidic, and there was a massive release of carbon into the atmosphere. The cause? Most likely natural. Volcanic activity, methane release. But here's the uncomfortable part. The speed and scale of that carbon injection looks strangely familiar. It resembles what we are doing now. Again, this does not mean there was a civilization, but it proves something important. If there had been one, we might not be able to tell the difference, because natural processes can mimic the same signals. And the Earth does not label its layers. It does not explain itself. It records, and then it moves on, which leads to a heavier idea. Civilization may not be a straight line. It may not be unique. It may not even be permanent. It could be a cycle, something that appears, alters the planet, disappears, and is forgotten. Not once, but potentially many times. Because the timescale of Earth is so vast that even something as complex as civilization could happen and vanish without leaving a clear trace. And if that's true, then we are not standing at the end of history. We might just be another layer, another temporary phase, another event that will eventually be compressed into rock, reduced to chemistry, and studied by something else, or by no one at all. Because the deeper truth here is not about ancient civilizations. It's about perspective. We see ourselves as permanent, but we exist inside a system that erases everything. And that system has been running for billions of years. So the real question is not, were we the first? The real question is, how many times can something exist on a planet that forgets everything? And more importantly, what are we leaving behind that will actually survive? Now we step back, all the way back, because if you look at everything we've explored, not as separate discoveries, but as one system, a different picture begins to form. We saw the oceans regulating temperature. We saw the magnetic field protecting the atmosphere. We saw the deep biosphere living beneath the crust. We saw cycles of destruction and renewal. And when you connect these pieces, something strange happens. The Earth stops looking like an object and starts looking like a system, not a passive one, an active one, a self-regulating one. This idea has a name, the Gaia hypothesis. It suggests that the Earth behaves like a living organism, not literally alive in the way we are, but functionally alive, because it maintains balance, temperature, atmosphere, ocean chemistry, all of it adjusts, stabilizes, responds, just like a body does. Think about it. If the planet gets too hot, processes begin that remove carbon from the atmosphere. If it gets too cold, other processes release it. Volcanoes act like vents, the oceans like circulation, the atmosphere like a lung, even the magnetic field acts like a shield, and life itself plays a role. Microorganisms regulate gases, plants shape the atmosphere, oceans absorb heat, everything interacts. Nothing exists in isolation. And then there's us, because we like to think we are separate from this system, observers, users, controllers. But that's not true. We are part of it, not metaphorically, physically. The iron in your blood was forged in stars. The water in your body is older than the planet itself. The salt in your veins is a direct echo of the first oceans. Even your brain, your thoughts, your awareness operate through electrical signals that mirror the electrical behavior of the planet. There's even a measurable resonance in the Earth's atmosphere, a constant low-frequency electromagnetic pulse called the Schumann resonance, around 7.83 hertz. And by coincidence or not, This frequency overlaps with the brain waves associated with relaxation and the edge of sleep, the state you are in right now. It's a subtle connection, but it suggests something deeper. We didn't just evolve on this planet. We evolved with it, within it, tuned to it, and that changes the way you see everything. Because if the Earth is a system, and we are part of that system, then we are not standing on the planet. We are an expression of it, a temporary form that the system takes, a way for matter to observe itself, to think, to question, to wonder. You are not separate from the story. You are the current chapter. Right now, as you listen, your body is part of the same cycle that shaped oceans, moved continents, and fed the deep biosphere. The same atoms moving through different forms: water, rock, air, life, thought, and eventually back again. Because nothing here is permanent. Not continents, not oceans, not civilizations, and not us. But that doesn't make it meaningless. It makes it part of something larger, something continuous, something that does not begin and does not end, only changes. And maybe that's the final shift. We started in the deep, following the path of water, from space to ocean, to trench, to stone, to life. And in the process, we found something else. We found ourselves. Not as observers, but as participants. Because the story of the Earth is not something that happened in the past. It is happening now, in the oceans, in the deep, and in you. So as the noise fades and the world grows quiet, remember this: you are not separate from the system. You are part of it, held by it, carried by it. The same planet that formed mountains and oceans is the one that is holding you in this moment. And it has been doing that your entire life, quietly, constantly, without asking anything in return. The ground beneath you is not still. It is slow. The silence around you is not empty. It is full of history, of movement, of life. Let it settle. Let the weight of it become calm. Let the scale of it become quiet. Because you don't need to understand all of it. You're already inside it. And for now, that's enough. Good night.